right, everyone seems to agree the NDP is surging. Can anyone run against a surge when the clock is in the final countdown? Jaime Watt and David Herle have been in situations like this in past campaigns. Well, so, gentlemen, what does history tell us? Can you run against a surge, Jaime?
Well, I think one of the things that history is telling us in this case is that what's gone before isn't what we should be looking at now. I think one of the things that all the campaigns are going to have to look at is figuring out where this surge is taking place and how do you run a national campaign and how do you correct a national campaign while at the same time recognizing that the surge is behaving differently, not only in regions, but also in ridings. So generally speaking, you don't want those ridings out doing their own thing. This time, you actually just might.
David?
Well, I think that it depends a little bit on whether it's a surge by an incumbent party that's maybe suffered a downturn in the election campaign, like Mulroney in '88, and then it's coming back. That's once that's happened, it's very difficult to turn that back. But in this case, we've got a party that a lot of people are voting for who've never voted before. I should be clear, I don't think at this point, at this late juncture, that this thing can be turned around. I think it can probably still be blunted. And I think in order to blunt it, one would need to present some fundamentally new evidence to the Canadian voter about the NDP. Many people voting for them would never have thought of them before or not thought of them seriously before. They haven't decided to vote for them on the basis of a lot of facts. Give them some new facts that change the equation in their minds. And I think based on, a campaign that we did in Nova Scotia in which the NDP came out of nowhere and almost formed the government, I think this could be blunted, but you have to do something that's very alien to political strategists and to politicians. In order to do it, you'd have to recognize publicly the reality of what's happening. They never want to do that. The Liberals want to say everything's fine.
They don't seem to be saying that anymore.
No, well, but I think you've got to get blunt with people and say something very fundamental is happening here, and you need to think about it, and here's why you need to think about it.
The problem is, as time goes by, and we're seeing more and more polls confirming this trend, is that the public's receptivity to these messages is declining. So this idea now that you can go and attack the NDP's numbers, this is about 3 weeks too late to be attacking their numbers. Those messages tend just to go over people's heads, and in fact, they reinforce the decision that people are making, and they actually drive them to that new place.
Somebody was mentioning to me today the biggest problem with the surge is trying to stay ahead of it, or at least even with it, because all the data we see in terms of polls is at least a couple of days old. So you have no idea how far ahead of it the surge is,
right,
and whether it can be stoppable in any way.
Well, I think that, though, you should have had, through your research and through your other sources of intelligence, some idea of what might happen to this. You should have gamed it out a little bit in advance, too. So I think that it was possible when we were sitting here last Wednesday, and we had the initial information out of Quebec from the crop poll to say, if that's true, and the party should have known whether it was true because they have their own research. But you're saying if that's true, then these things are quite possibly going to happen. This is how this will roll out, given the dynamic of the campaign right now. And rather than say, well, let's wait for 2 or 3 more days to see if that is solidified, you needed, if you were in a vulnerable position, to get out in front of that right away. And if you have to err, overshoot. Right? Because these things, as my former colleague Ellie Elboim wrote, run fast and hard when they run.
It reminds me of that expression from Pogo, I've seen the enemy and it is us. And I think often the enemy is those people in those strategy rooms having a really hard time coming to grips with the fact that this new data might be real. And as David said, they ought to have been on this last week, and their own internal polling ought to have been pointing them in the direction. The question is, were they able to read it and actually take it both to here and move forward? That's really tough for people to do.
So we enter these last 5 or 6 days of the campaign. How different is it? I mean, you kind of hinted at this, Jaime, in your first answer, but is this really a very different situation than we've encountered certainly in recent history as we enter the last final few days of a campaign? And you add on top of it, all kidding aside, but the royal wedding does take a factor in here. It's kind of blots over the news hole over for a couple of days. But how different are things?
Well, I think that they're very different. You can use '93 as an analogy, where some parties are coming out of nowhere, where established parties are failing, and there's that comparison. But we're not even sure. In 1993, we knew at this stage clearly who was going to win that election. We're not even quite sure who's going to win this election right now. That's how dynamic this is. And I personally have not seen a Canadian election like this at either the federal or provincial level. This is really one for the ages.
Jaime.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the challenges that we're seeing is people, Canadians, appear to be willing to make a choice that they've never been willing to make before. Not just in Quebec, but right across the country. We're beginning to see people willing to choose something else. And that choice is something that, as strategists, we don't really know how to grapple with or how to fight against. It's like fighting a whole new kind of war. And then, as you pointed out with the royal wedding, I mean, I counted up the amount of time the network spent on the royal wedding last night versus the election. It was a tie. And I bet you tonight is not a tie, and it's going to be, tip in favor of Kate's dress and William and Harry's tails before this.
Can you give me some advice on that?
Before this is out. So it just makes it tougher for people to actually inject new messages into that media environment.
Okay, well, tonight we're tipping heavily in favor of the election, but knowing full well that over the next couple of nights, that's going to be difficult with all the focus on London.
Especially for those people that need to change the dynamic.
Right.
Yeah, and that is where the big problem is for those who are trying to do that. It's a great couple of days for Leighton and the NDP, one assumes,
No kidding.
if their surge is continuing. Gentlemen, thank you both very much.